The opening words are by Harry Baker, who is a rap British poet. Life is too short to eat celery. Life is too long to feed jealousy. And life is likely just the right length to need therapy. May you be seriously silly. May you be wickedly kind. May you be brilliantly dumb sometimes, and yet stupidly bright. May your certainty have doubts. May your weirdness be the norm. May the coolest thing about you be your warmth. May you be powerfully vulnerable, or at least mightily soft. May you be a contradiction, and yet at the same time, not. And whether you are any, none, or all of the above all, may you know that you are loved. My reading this morning comes from the writings of Frederick Beuchner, who may be familiar to some of you, has written many wonderful books. He died in his 90s a couple of years ago. He was a ordained Presbyterian minister, but spent most of his time lecturing and teaching, and this is what he wrote from a short piece called Love Each Other. And again, just be ready, it's a little more traditional than you often hear from me. Matthew the tax collector and Thomas the doubter, Peter the rock and Judas the traitor, Mary Magdalene and Lazarus' sister Martha, and the popcorn-eating old woman and the fat man in the pickup truck. They are all our family, and you and I are their family and each other's family. Because this is what Jesus has called us as the church to be. Our happiness is all mixed up with each other's happiness, and our peace with each other's peace. Our own happiness, our own peace can never be complete until we find some way of sharing it with people who, the way things are now, have no happiness or know no peace. Jesus calls us to show this truth forth. Live this truth forth. Be the light of the world, he said. Where there are dark places, be the light, especially there. Be the salt of the earth. Bring out the true flavor of what it is to be alive truly. Be alive truly. Be life givers to others. That is what Jesus tells the disciples to do. That is what Jesus tells the church, tells us to be and to do. Love each other. Heal the sick. Raise the dead. Cleanse the lepers. Cast out the demons. This is what loving each other means. If the church is doing things like that, then it is doing what Jesus told it to be. If it is not doing things like that, no matter how many other good things and useful things it may be doing instead, then it is not doing what Jesus told it to be. It is as simple as that. I wrote out my sermon And as often happens, I wake on Sunday morning with a new inspiration. This morning it was to find this book, which if you knew my house, it's a miracle. Simply a miracle. It's called Nature Cruisings, and it's by a man, a Universalist fellow named John Van Dyke, and it's inscribed here to Julia Greenway. All the best wishes of John Van Dyke, John Van Scoik, Boston, December 1928. And the reason that I sort of reached for this, and the idea came to me somewhere in the middle of the night, was that it just seemed like a better way to communicate what I was hoping to communicate about the Universalist side of our tradition. And so I'll proceed with this at this time. He's writing about his life in a small town near, kind of down near Oneonta, and he makes mention of these little villages and towns in that county. And I just want to say just a little bit about what he has to say here. "How does it happen," said our old neighbor, "that I never hear you say anything about your church? You have a good word for the Lutherans, the Methodists, the Baptists, the Reformed down at Cobble Skull, and even for the Catholics." Even for them, wow. "But I never hear you mention the Universalists. Pretty good lot, aren't they?" "Now, you strike me in a tender place," I said in reply. "I love the Universalists, and they have done a lot for me. I think so much of them that I don't like to talk about them. It sounds like boasting about your family." "I know," he rejoined, "but we are interested in them too. They are not likely to come up in this hollow and start an opposition church. So let us know something about them." "No," I said, "they are not likely to come up in the hollow, and they don't believe in planting more churches than people can support. They don't like to split up neighborhoods. Besides, they have a good opinion of other churches and want to see them succeed. Of course, in places there is little real religion, nothing but the dry shucks of harsh old theology, and in those places they are needed. I wish there could be more of them in such places." "But what are Universalists?" said the persistent old man. "We don't have them around here." "Yes, you do," I replied quickly. "Old Deacon Brown is a Universalist, not in the sense of being a member of the Universalist Church, but in the everyday sense of the word. A Universalist is one who has interest in and sympathy for the whole human family." Did you ever notice that the deacon pricks up his ears and pays attention no matter what race or tribe is mentioned? He wants to know about them and never does waif or stray or show up, but he tries to lend them a hand. "I reckon you Universalists have done your full share of the work of getting your ideas over," said the old neighbor empathetically. "Yes, I think so," I rejoined. "We are not numerous, but President Roosevelt," this being Teddy Roosevelt, "but Teddy Roosevelt once remarked that we had done as Universalists more to leaven the lump with tolerance and goodwill than any other church." A good word for the Universalists. Their ideas have perhaps in some ways become part of the mainstream thinking at least within mainstream Protestant faiths. And a couple of years ago, a book was published by an evangelical minister from whom you would not typically hear some of these same ideas, a minister whose name is Rob Bell. And his book was titled Love Wins. And it opened up this old debate that they were talking about briefly in the reading I shared, with the ideas of what is to become of the human race and whether heaven or hell is the place we will end in eternity. Well, What makes this a revolutionary book in many ways is that the central thesis of it was that the essence of God is love, and that any dogma that claims that a select few Christians will spend forever in some joyous place called heaven, while the rest of humanity spends forever in torment and punishment in hell, well, Bell acknowledged and argued that those ideas are misguided and toxic. This coming from an evangelical Christian. As Bell deepens his understanding of heaven and hell, he envisions heaven as something that begins and lives on earth and is experienced in the moment we each live out a life of goodness and mercy and compassion and love. And hell, as he envisions it, is more of a condition also experienced on earth, than some eternal fate. He makes, from his perspective, hell a consequence of how we choose to live, in this life, rather than a judgment on those choices. In effect, he makes the argument, the case that God would not have any use for hell. And before his book hit the bookshelves, alarm was raised throughout the evangelical communities, and his critics descended upon him with the harshest denunciation that they could possibly dream up. They declared that Rob Bell was a universalist. That's throwing down the gauntlet. The theological concept of universalism goes back to the earliest days of the Christian church, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of this common era. The notion was that God was, and I'm going to use their traditional language, that God's children would never be consigned to eternal punishment, just as that would never happen that anyone's own child, the parent, would place them in punishment. In time, universalism within the early Christian church was determined to be a heresy. And for over 1,000 years, church doctrine and theology and liturgy were dominated not by the universalist concept of this universalist God of love, but was dominated more by a dualistic kind of faith that was balanced in some ways by heaven and hell. Those who came before us in this tradition we share were a lot more radical than we sometimes think of ourselves being today. For most other churches, the belief in hell provided a kind of degree of social control, of stability. This idea that hell was a threat hanging over people would help to make them behave better. And this was a predominant belief. The early Universalist preachers were often called fire escape preachers, with the idea that they would help people escape from the flames of hell. Up in Canton, New York, where I served for a short time, the local Presbyterians of the town were up in arms in the 1850s when a Universalist theological school was going to be established at St. Lawrence University. And the locals felt that the presence of those young Universalist men would be corrupting influences upon their innocent young women folk up in Canton. Well, in some ways they were probably right to fear the presence of this Universalist seminary, but they were fearing it for the wrong reasons. The Universalist legacy of this loving God long ago displaced the harsh, judging God of Calvinism that was predominant amongst most of the mainstream Protestants, including the Presbyterians of Canton. And there it was, love won. But a discourse on the scriptural bands of universalism, or the historical evolution of universalism, or even a deeper critique of Bell's book, is not what I want to leave you with this morning. Those things matter, but more as a larger context than as the subject of this sermon. What I most want to engage with is this idea of love winning, which of course raises a couple of immediate questions. The first being, well, what's love? The second, what is it that is won? And three, is it worth the effort to win when we know in our souls that there will be times when we will lose? Large questions. Though I implied I would, I'm not going to try to define love. In part because, as we know, it is far too vast and deep and varied a question. But mostly because I'm convinced that I'm just not wise enough to know. But I will admit that I know it when I see it. I know when I see love. And I know it when I feel it, as I'm sure each of you can conjure in your own heart. The sort of love I'm speaking of this morning, in the context of a religious community, is probably best described by philosopher, social activist Cornel West, when he said that one should never forget that justice is what love looks like in public. Not the private, personal sense of love that we know, but the larger sense of love that we see acting out, being given life amongst the larger communities we live in. That justice is what love looks like in public. I've returned to that thought over and over again, and prefer it over the translations and abstractions of theology that are often posed. I'm reminded of some of the most transformative sources of love that we go about bestowing on each other, whether they be strangers or friends, with little or no expectation that such love would be returned. This is a concept of love that looks at love not as a bargain that we transact with another, but simply a pure blessing we bestow. And justice is the principle that instructs us that the starving should be fed. And love is what ladles the soup and butters the bread. My second question is, what is won by this kind of love? In traditional theological terms, what is won is a place in heaven. To me, that would be a consolation prize. I won't turn it down if it's there. But I would have to admit that I was hoping for something more. As I understand this religious tradition from which I have been born into, and as it finds expression in my own personal faith, the purpose of this realized, embodied form of love is to bring heaven to life on earth. To recognize and to realize that this state of being, which is not some distant promise, but it is an immediate possibility among us. Not a heaven populated by perfect angels, but by fragile human beings who strive and struggle, sometimes just to love one another. We who frequently fail and who have to learn in life both how to ask for and how to grant forgiveness. I think it was Mark Twain who said he'd like to go to heaven for the climate, but hell for the company. By whatever name it goes by, I'd rather stick to my own kind and learn from the earthbound angels with broken wings and crooked halos who grace us with the kind of knowledge of what is possible here and now. And we all know people who embody those values. And lastly, the question lingers, is it worth the effort to win when we know that we will sometimes lose? This isn't the question of a cynic alone. It's the question that any thinking, observant, rational person is obligated to ask themselves and to somehow answer for themselves. If you're looking for evidence, for absolutes, well, the evidence is in. Love does not always win. Floods wash away towns and villages. Blood clots lodge in people's brains. Goldfish and hamsters and grandparents die. Friendships are betrayed. Adorable children are bullied and humiliated. And on some cosmic scorecard, love, well, I believe it somehow ends up winning. But for most of us where we stand, love is up against some rough odds for winning. To which I have two responses which I've come to rely upon in my own encounters with doubts about such things, and sometimes over my despair over the fragility of love. The first, that there is great purpose and meaning and value in the process of working on love's side, if we can think of it that way. Mother Teresa once said something in response to a question that someone posed to her about how could she continue to work in the face of such overwhelming, unending poverty. And she replied this way. She said that she was not called to be successful, she was called to be faithful. Two very different approaches. If your purpose and goal in life is always to be successful, most of us would find an endeavor such as that to be somewhat burdensome and overwhelming. But if the commitment is to be faithful to ideals of justice and fairness and compassion, then we have a chance at enduring the shortfalls of ourselves when we walk through the broken shards, sometimes of life. The other antidote to this impulse to give up on love's hope of winning is something I beg you to receive. A reason for us to persevere. It sounds so simple. It's the realization that we never, ever know the consequences of our actions. We think we do. We deceive ourselves into believing that we know the consequences of our actions. But all I can tell you is what I have learned from my own life, my own work, my own relationships. I never know the true consequences of any of my actions. This is hard to accept, but it's really essential, especially if we want to be faithful to the deepest ideals of this form of love. We can't engage in it only because we think that we will succeed, or even know what the success will look like in the end. It's easy for us in this culture we live on to be desperate to see the results, to see a way to measure our progress, to evaluate our efforts. It's like we're at work having our performance appraisal, and we want to be told that all we have done has value and meaning. And no one can tell us that. That remains a matter of faith. We've got to give up that kind of thinking. It's not ours to measure. It's not even ours to know. All we have charge of ourselves is our own actions, our own scraps of love that we have to pass and spread around the world. And that is all, and that must be enough. I'm going to close with a part of a little essay that was written by George Saunders. It's titled, "A Press Release for PRKA, People Reluctant to Kill for an Abstraction." People reluctant to kill for an abstraction. It's mostly about love. He describes a world that I wouldn't mind living in. And this is part of what he wrote. In addition to the above listed and planned activities completed by our members, a number of unplanned activities were completed by part-time members, even non-members. Things such as this. In London, a bitter homophobic grandfather whose grocery bag broke open gave a loaf of very nice bread to a balding gay man who stopped to help him pick up his groceries. A stooped, toothless woman in Tokyo pounded her head with her hands, tired beyond belief of her lifelong feelings of anger and negativity, and silently prayed that her heart would somehow be opened before it was too late. In Syracuse, New York, holding the broken body of his kitten, a man felt a sudden kinship for all small things. Even declared non-members would appear responded to our efforts. In Pakistan, for example, a recent Al-Qaeda recruit remembered the way an elderly American tourist once made an encouraging remark about his English, and how, as she made the remark, she touched his arm like a mother. In Gaza, an Israeli soldier and a young Palestinian, just before averting their eyes and muttering insults in their respective languages, exchanged a brief look of mutual shame. Who are we? A word about our membership. Since the world began, we have gone about our work quietly, resisting the urge to generalize, valuing the individual over the group, the actual over the conceptual, the inherent sweetness of the present moment over a theoretical peaceful future of salvation. Many of us have trouble sleeping and lie awake at night worrying about something catastrophic befalling someone we love. And we rise in the morning with no plans to convert anyone via beating, humiliation, or invasion. And to tell the truth, we are tired. We work. We would just like some peace and quiet. When wrong, we think about it for a while and apologize. We stand under awnings during urban thunderstorms, moved to thoughtfulness by the troubled umbrella-fringed faces rushing by. And in moments of crisis, we pat one another awkwardly on the back, mumbling shy truisms. Rushing to an appointment, remembering a friend who has passed away, our eyes well with tears, and we think, well, my God, he could be a pain sometimes, but still I'm lucky to have known him. This is PRKA. To those who would oppose us, I would simply say, we are many. We are worldwide. We, in fact, outnumber you. And though you are louder, and though you create a momentary ripple on the water of life, we will endure. We will prevail. Join us. Resistance is futile. May love win.